Thank you very much. It's great to be with you here today. I wish that was me playing the saxophone, but I'm not quite that good. We have a very brief time with you, so we're going to try and cover a lot of stuff in the brief time we have. The subject, as you heard, is emotional intelligence and global leadership. Emotional intelligence, something I've been very passionate about for at least the last 25 years. And in terms of global leadership, as we all know, workplaces 100 years ago probably looked something like this. Workplaces today in some jurisdictions may look like this. So we all know that the workplace has changed. So it's pretty obvious, I hope to most people, that leadership has changed. You might not know that by the model of leadership in some places, but leadership has changed significantly over the last 100 years. I'll give you one quick example. We all know Henry Ford, revered as a business leader 100 years ago. When he was faced with a challenge, you remember that famous saying, any car you want as long as it's the color black? And he kept that up for much longer than he should have because it was a competitive advantage for some of the other car industries. He refused to give that up. He refused to change, largely because leaders in the past were what I call ego-driven, driven by the past. If I said something last week, I've got to say that today, otherwise I'd be inconsistent. And leaders in the old days didn't want to be inconsistent. They would go down with the ship. Can you do that today as a leader? Can we have those same values? I call that steadfastness. They're very steadfast as a characteristics. But Bill Gates, when faced with a similar situation, behaved quite differently. When the internet first came out, he very clearly toured the world and said Microsoft was not going to be investing in the internet. It was 20 years away, and all it was good for was transmitting video, and the bandwidth wasn't there yet. So what happened after that was a couple fellows, Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen, set up a little company called Netscape in Jim Clark's business and created the largest IPO in US history, and the world changed. Did Bill Gates stay there and say, well, I said we're not going for the internet? Absolutely not. He turned a multi-billion-dollar company around literally on a dime. In fact, he was so aggressive about it, the Department of Justice had to get involved in some of that change. So one of the key characteristics of today's leaders is adaptability. They're more future-driven, if they're good leaders, as opposed to driven by the past. Once he saw the light and the change, he was able to adapt. And we've tested hundreds of leaders, and we found that the good ones are able to adapt and change. Another thing that Gates points out that's very important is that future leaders will be those who empower others. Part of a good leader is empowering other people. So how do we prepare tomorrow's leaders? As we know, the workplace has changed, and you have to be global. You have to lead around the world where cultures are different. So we need a whole new set of tools. The way we select leaders and employees generally today is quickly getting out of date. I mean, we look at where they went to school, what their academic background is. We look at their resumes in terms of past experience. We look at their technical skills. We look at cognitive intelligence. And sometimes we even look at things like personality. But that's changing rapidly. For example, one of the quotes from a senior HR person at Google talks about how they analyze their data to the ultimate degree, that things like GPA are not predictive of who succeeds at work. There's different characteristics that we found that are important today. Intelligence has evolved over time, right? It's not the way it was in the early days, and that's pretty important. So today, what do we value? We value people who are really high on these sort of technical types of skills. But intelligence meant something else back here with our ancestors. It meant being able to walk in a jungle and see a lion, and we weren't analytical. We didn't say, wow, I wonder what species that is. Is it male or female? If we were analytical about it, we'd be lunch, right? We wouldn't have survived. But the reason we adapted is because we used a different part of the brain to make those decisions. We used the lower parts of the brain, and the limbic system, and the hippocampus to help us decide that if I don't get out of here real quick, I'm going to be lunch. And that's changed over time. We don't use that part of the brain as much anymore. we've really pushed ourselves towards logic. In fact, we've come to a point where the ideal leader is someone like this who doesn't even experience emotion, because for the last couple of 100 years or so, we've squeezed emotion out of the workplace. That's precisely what I was told when I started talking about this in England. We don't have emotion in the workplace here. Unfortunately, that's changed over the last number of years. But, when people think of emotion, they think of this, and they run, right? Unfortunately, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. So emotion is important in the workplace. If you think about it, if we go back to Starship Enterprise, who was it that ran the ship, right? Who was the captain? Well, actually, he's a Canadian, just so you know. We're from Canada. But it was James Kirk, William Shatner. Now, it was a real interesting story when that story was developed. Gene Roddenberry's script originally had Captain Kirk as a walking textbook on legs. He was the valedictorian at the Starship University. Now, it was William Shatner, according to his autobiography, who actually changed that character, because he knew intuitively that the guy who ran the ship was not the smartest one on the ship. The one who ran the ship was, in his own words, a man with very human emotions. Very important difference, and I think that was one of the important things that led to the success of that series. Here's a quote from Randy Pausch. You may remember him, the last lectures, a famous professor. He nailed it. He said about James Kirk, he didn't know everything about everything. Scotty knew more than him about engineering, Spock about science, and Bones about medicine. So the leader is the one who takes all this information, uses his gut feelings, and comes up with hopefully the right decisions. In fact, there's a real interesting study published not too long ago in Harvard Business Review, where they actually took fMRIs of business people, a number of business people, solving a business problem, a purely logical business problem. They had to create a business plan in a certain situation. And what they had is an independent group of professionals evaluate those business plans in terms of how good they were. So they found that some of the people use this part of the brain, which is expected, the frontal lobes, which is where you do your planning, executive functioning. But other people used the emotional part of the brain much more. And lo and behold, the best business plans came from those people who use the emotional parts of the brain. Because it's not all just logic, even though we may think it is. There's an emotional tag that kicks in, the ability to be intuitive and so on. Emotion is a really big part of it. So emotional intelligence became very popular in around 1995. You may have seen this article in Time. It sort of spread around the world. We were already working in that field prior to that, looking at ways to measure this thing. And now, since those early days, there's a number of different theories or models of emotional intelligence, but they all share these three things when you talk about EI. The ability to identify emotions in yourself and others, the ability to manage the emotions in yourself and others, and finally, the ability to focus emotional energy on getting things done, whether it's to motivate you, whether it's to make good decisions. And I study special groups like musicians, artists, and successful CEOs and Olympic athletes, and we find they're really strong in that ability to focus their energy, their emotional energy. Now, I'm going to present a circle. We heard about circles this morning. We heard some not nice things about it, but the reality is circles are important. Let me tell you why. Because this is not a circle of behavior traits, as we heard about, and it's not competencies that we heard about. These are actual skills. And the reason that's important is that skills, as we heard also, are more changeable. We can train people on skills. So if you're introverted or you're extroverted, that's a personality characteristic. It's nice to know, but we can't really train for that. So you could be an introvert and you're a great salesperson. You could be an extrovert. You could also be a great salesperson. But I can tell you that there's certain emotional skills that will differentiate you because you may be more assertive or less assertive, and that will affect your ability to sell. We've done research. We've tested several million people in hundreds of occupations, and we've shown that these emotional skills make a difference in performance. It was nice to hear that people are being evaluated on one item, but I would really be careful about making decisions about people based on a single item. Because as psychologists, we learn that single items are not very reliable, and you need a cluster of items, and that's why we have this silly little wheel, because you need a cluster of items in an area. I can't say if you're assertive based on one item or one question. We do need a number of them to be reliable. And so basically, here the model breaks into these areas: the ability to perceive and express ourselves. People who are not very expressive run into trouble. The ability to develop and maintain social relationships, and we heard earlier how important interpersonal skills are in succeeding. And the ability to use emotions in an effective way, as I said earlier, using emotions to make good decisions. We've studied financial managers, people on the stock exchange, and we found that those who are better able to manage their emotions make better financial decisions. You may want to check this out with your own financial advisor, but we've got our data. So those who don't manage emotions well make decisions too quickly. Or on the other hand, they may delay their decision for the wrong reasons and make bad financial decisions. So we've studied all kinds of special groups to show how these factors are especially important in predicting success. And finally, the ability to cope with challenges is another key area of emotional intelligence. I'm going to talk a bit about gender because as I travel around the world talking about this, one of the biggest questions I get is what's the influence of gender on this and on leadership, right? We did the first studies in the world looking at gender and emotional intelligence back in the early 90s, and we got a lot of media attention, and people still cite that data. And usually I would ask you the question, but I only got 15 minutes. I can't do a lot of interactive stuff. But the point was, we found that overall there was no real significant difference between men and women in their overall EI, but there were specific factors. So empathy was significantly higher in women than in men. Shouldn't be a surprise at this point. Interpersonal relations were higher in women than in men. On the other hand, self-regard and stress tolerance was higher in men than in women. So this led to a bit of controversy, and I was doing a lot of presentations, and some of them to feminist groups who got a little bit upset with this. They felt that, because I sort of stressed the advantages, the empathy and so on, and they said, no, you don't understand it. In the business world, we have to be tough, we have to be aggressive, we have to be tougher than the man. And I said, no, that's the wrong way to go. You have to leverage your strengths and not go after those areas. Well, to make a sort of a long story short, there was a recent study that was cited in Inc. magazine that kind of dealt with this issue. They got 32,000 people to rate a bunch of characteristics, like you see here. Things like plans for the future, resilient, loyal, flexible, empathic, aggressive, proud. And the ones on that side, the light blue ones, were rated as feminine values, and the ones on this side were rated as masculine values, right? So being proud, aggressive, analytical, independent were seen as male. Then they had a separate group, another 32,000 people, rate what would you like to see in a leader? What do you look for? Well, the higher up the scale on the far side is what people wanted in their leaders. They wanted people who are reasonable, loyal, flexible, empathic, mostly the female traits. Really hard data that people prefer that in their leaders. Then they looked at it by country internationally, and they plotted that, and the further over the circle, the happier people were, and the bigger the circle, the better the GNP, the better the average person was in that particular country. Canada, I'd like to say, comes out pretty strong, but you also have Brazil, UK, US, pretty high up in that area, whereas China and India, where it's more the traditional masculine-dominated kind of leadership, people are doing less well individually, and it affects a number of different areas. So we've replicated our study looking at emotional intelligence around the world with much larger samples, and here's what we found. We looked at 154 countries, the UN regions of the world, equivalent samples. The breakdowns included 23 countries. Each had at least a minimum of 100 records, and that was the breakdown. And what we found, and this is universal data from worldwide, of 20,000 people, the empathy is higher for men everywhere where you see blue. and this is around the world. The shades are just a bit, reflect the difference. Emotional self-awareness is higher for men everywhere you see blue. And this is very strong data. Emotional expression, our ability to express ourselves, everywhere you see blue is where the men score higher. And interpersonal relationships, same pattern. The blue parts are where men score higher. On the other hand, stress tolerance, women score higher where you see red. In problems, using emotion to solve problems, women score higher where you see red. And self-regard, the same. So you can see we find these differences are fairly consistent. What Google looks for when selecting managers, according to their own writing, is emergent leaders. And there's a lot of data on emergent leaders, and I'm not going to have time to go through all that, but it's basically people who take charge of a situation, who are not appointed leaders, but know how to really take charge. I'm just going to sum up with what we've discovered after a study looking at 220 leaders, successful, non-successful, 4 pillars that differentiated the successful leaders from the non-successful, all related to emotional intelligence. The first is authenticity. Leaders who are authentic were much more successful as leaders. The second is coaching. Leaders who coach, it's not enough anymore just to tell people what to do. You have to be a good coach. And thirdly, insight. Those who are able to communicate a purpose of the organization are far more successful. And finally, innovation. Those who take risks are far more successful. And as well, there are derailers. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Maribel, who's going to talk about the experience at the Universal Music Group.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Stephen did a fabulous job of talking about the importance of emotional intelligence and how it impacts career and success. And what I'd like to do now is actually just take a few minutes and walk you through an example of how we at Universal Music have actually designed and launched a career development program targeting high potentials. First, a little bit about our organization. We are in the business of music and entertainment. So if you think about Universal Music Group, it's actually a plethora of different labels. What you're seeing up here is just a sampling. We have a very diverse artist roster, and every genre of music is represented. Christian, rock, hip hop, soul, R&B, electronic dance music, which is the new craze now, and I know that I'm leaving some out, but given this diverse label roster and even artist roster, you can imagine that there is no one culture at Universal Music Group. And we are okay with that. We actually like to appreciate and celebrate the different cultures that every one of these different labels brings to the company. And from a development standpoint, as you can probably imagine, that can also present its own set of challenges because we're not looking at leadership development competencies. It's not even a word that we use in the organization. So knowing that we couldn't introduce language like that, this is the music business, we're a very creative type of industry and company, we wanted to instead, in terms of developing and launching programs, we wanted to look for opportunities to have some sense of commonality in terms of how we develop people throughout the organization. So what I should also say is that, as a company, we're global, 5,000 plus employees. But this is what people tend to think success looks like. It's one straight path. It's, I'm right here, tell me where I need to go, how can I get there tomorrow? And we know that success is actually pretty messy. Career success is messy. There is no one formula. And this was a point that we really wanted to integrate into all of the programs and initiatives that we designed that had more of a formal structure. We wanted people to realize that when it comes to developing your people and your talent, it's not about tell me what step I need to take next. It's what are the different opportunities that are available to me and how can I take the initiative to actually take that on. So this is a bit more of the philosophy that we really push into the programs. First, we want all of the participants in any of our development initiatives to understand that there is no one career path. People do need to first take it upon themselves to figure out, what are my passions? What's my end goal? And if I know what my passions and end goals are, then how can I get there? Because there are many different steps and ways up to get there. It's not just that one path. Keeping that in mind, we had conversations with more than several, with a variety of business leaders throughout the organization. And we asked them, okay, we're going to build a program. We are not going to introduce competencies, but we do want to find some common thread. So please think about the people in your organizations that have been successful. What makes them successful? What is it about these successful people that stands out? So there wasn't a tried and true formula, no algorithms, nothing like that. It was more just open-ended conversation of these presidents and general managers of all of the labels that you saw a moment ago. And there were a few common threads. The first, and by the way, we turned this as the foundation of our career development program, which we call Connect, and I'll walk you through that in a moment. The 5 guiding principles for us is, first off, anyone that participates in our development programs really needs to understand that development is a journey. It's a process. It's an experience. It's not, I'm doing this, now what next? Am I going to get promoted, or am I going to get that raise? So that was something that we consciously integrated. We also wanted people to understand that when it comes to empowerment, yes, you want your manager to empower you, but empowerment is also for the taking. It's best for you to take that first step instead of waiting like that sense of empowerment is around you. So we wanted them to feel like it is something that they could assume was there first. We also wanted our participants to understand that relationships are consciously built. It's one of those things where communication and relationships are a two-way street. So whether it's in a mentoring relationship, or you're a new employee in the organization, or you're just building that relationship with your boss, it's a two-way street. So be conscious about how often and how you are communicating with your people and with your team members. Initiative trumps waiting and hoping. So what we mean by this is, many people, especially those that have just sort of entered the workforce, I still find that they tend to see that they're waiting to be tapped on the shoulder. And we want to make the point, or we wanted to make the point, that initiative is all around you. You really have to look for and plug those opportunities. So find those opportunities and plug that gap. And the last guiding principle that we really wanted to build into our programs is about action. Every little step, however big or small you think may be, action is progress. You may not know if it's the right step, that's okay, but do something consciously every couple of weeks or every couple of months at the most that gets you closer to whatever your career development goals are. Keeping these 5 principles in mind, we developed a program that we call Connect. And this program has a couple of goals. First, we wanted to look at individual contributors. So for our organization, individual contributors are analysts, coordinators, administrative assistants, folks that have a manager title but do not manage others. They may be project managers in that example. And we kept this audience in mind, and because we already have programs that identify high potential leaders at a director and VP level and above, we wanted to create an opportunity to tackle the individual contributor group because they're often underrepresented in organizations. We spend so much of our resources on developing our future leaders, which is great. We should not stop that. But we also wanted to be conscious about developing folks who are not yet managing others. Not everyone wants to manage others, that's okay. But in looking at individual contributors, we titled this program Connect, and the focus was on career development for high potential emerging leaders. So what does that look like? First off, from a design standpoint, the program is about 5 months. And the commitment is approximately 32 to 36 hours. And what you're seeing up here are really 3 major buckets of what we asked. I'll take you through the selection process in a moment, but what you're seeing here is 3 major buckets of what we asked participants to commit to if they were going to be interested. First was the focus on self. We had a couple of self-assessments. We had 1 self-assessment actually and a 360. And part of the focus on self was also helping them understand, how do I see myself, how do people around me see me, and what am I going to do about it? Okay, great, now I have this piece of information, now what am I going to do about it to help me stand out more and really be an emerging leader in my organization? And part of that was also some one-on-one coaching, reflection, and action planning. So this was through a series of meetings. We also got the same group together once the people were selected, and we got them in more of a group workshop setting format. And they were exposed to a few different concepts, strategies, and tools. Communication styles, we talked about emotional intelligence and what that really looks like in the workplace and how that impacts their success. We talked about getting them from understanding what these skills are to actually putting these skills in practice. And we also talked about a few other important things, like regardless of whatever your role is, how can you influence others without authority? How can you communicate with presence and confidence? How do you understand the difference between assertive communication and passive-aggressive communication? And we really wanted our people to understand that. The other piece is, because this is a program for individual contributors, we wanted them to walk away with an understanding of how they could demonstrate leadership in everyday situations. Those opportunities are all around us, and this was in more of a workshop setting, but they had such rich insights. The last piece I'll say, for leveraging insights, these were opportunities in more of a one-on-one setting where we actually matched them with mentors. These were directors and VPs in the organization. We brought them different guest speakers. There was peer coaching. So from the people that were in the program, there was an opportunity for them to sort of self-select someone, and we gave them a little bit of structure, and they sort of guided and coached each other through some of the challenges that they experienced. Of course, action planning and highlights as well. A little bit about the selection process. So I mentioned that this program is for individual contributors. Well, we could have started by asking the directors or the heads of the business units to nominate their people. But because this is a career development program, we wanted to first look at people who took that initiative to want to participate. So it was actually initiated by the employee. So the employee initiated by completing an application process. The employee then asked their manager to endorse them and to provide some additional commentary, which was then sent to us in learning and development. And then we had a conversation with the business unit leader and with the HRE. For us, HRE is the HR business partner. And finally, there was a small committee that actually was part of the selection process. We looked at three things. First off, I mentioned no competencies. So we identified some key characteristics that would help us sort of differentiate, how is this applicant different from this other applicant? And we put it into three different buckets: performance, potential, and motivation. This is more an art than a science, I should say. We put this together based on what we felt worked for our culture. And I'll let you just take a look at that for a moment. This is basically the criteria that we looked at. I should say that we had about 85 applications. We focused this program on the West Coast first. 85 applications, and we selected 20 people. So what happens to the other 60 people that raised their hand and took the initiative? We gave them an opportunity to participate and have first dibs, so to speak, in other programs and initiatives that we were launching. We still wanted them to feel encouraged to continue to participate in other aspects. So I'd like to highlight just a couple of specific things that are part of the program. This is one particular communication style profile. We used a profile called DISC, D-I-S-C, and we felt it worked well for our culture. People come to the workplace and they essentially are one of 4 different styles. We're really all a blend of styles, but we felt in evaluating different communication tools, we first thought about what works for universal music, what language can be introduced, and how can our people leverage this, and we chose a model that really nicely fit into all of the other programs that we have in place. What's nice about this particular tool is that it does provide insight for the participant as to communication style priorities, strengths, areas of development, and strategies. The other assessment that we introduced is a 360 assessment. Stephen talked about that a moment ago, and that's the EQI. This was of particular importance to us to introduce into this program because at this level, we really wanted people to understand that, there are many things that need to happen for you to feel like you have been successful. And one of those things is to be aware of how emotionally intelligent and how emotionally astute you are in the workplace and out of the workplace. And we introduced this as a 360. Very insightful. This information, as you can imagine, when you get a 360, it can be overwhelming. And after people received this initial feedback, we actually got together with them in a one-on-one setting, and we walked them through and we helped them really understand what all this feedback means. What does the DISC profile mean, and what does the 360 feedback mean? How are people seeing you around you? What are those strengths? And how can we help you leverage those strengths as well as fine-tune those skills? So this was in more of a private coaching setting, and a couple of coaching sessions came to light. Very impactful. The other piece to mention as I wrap up is the mentorship experience. This is where we connected them with directors and VPs, and there was more of a formal matching process. Personally, I'm a fan of organic mentoring, where the relationship naturally forms. But in this process, we decided to add structure, because at the individual contributor level, we find that people are incredibly successful and technically brilliant, but they're still not ready to just approach someone. And we wanted to help them get a little closer to having some of these relationships with leaders in the organization. So a bit of a matching process there. And just a couple of other comments. This is really my closing slide. From an application standpoint, we launched this program here on the West Coast, but we are a global company, and this was essentially a pilot for us. So now that our program concluded just a couple of months ago, our international territories are actually looking at the feasibility of launching a similar program with maybe making a few tweaks here and there for their audiences or their employees throughout the organization. What's nice about the way we integrated this program is that we were very conscious about trying to build a culture of development from the bottom up. We've got other programs at the top, but we really wanted to sort of close that gap. And this process also gave us insight into talent, high potential talent in individual contributor roles. The last piece is that we have found that leaders have really sprouted through this process. People that went through this experience we have heard from them directly, as well as their bosses and the business unit heads, that there have been some great initiatives that people in this program have actually had more of the confidence and courage to bring ideas to the table. And for us, that's really a great way to evaluate what's been working. So thank you all for your time. We have one more speaker. We're looking forward to that. Thank you.